Right. So I think normally where we start is the question of, do you need a visa? And I think that this remains a really challenging question for a lot of artists and managers and presenters, because the question always comes down to, what are those situations when an artist can come to the US and do something that does not require them to have an employment-based visa? Now, if the artist is coming from an ESTA country, meaning usually mostly Western Europe, Australia, a handful of other countries around the world, that means coming without a visa at all. If they're coming from some other part of the world, it means coming to the US to do work-related things on what's effectively a tourist visa or a visitor's visa, a B1 or B2 or a B1/B2. This is an important question because a lot of people, when artists are faced with the process of coming to the US, the first thing they try to figure out is, how do I avoid having to go through the hassle and expense of getting an artist visa, an artist employment-based visa? So it's important for us to touch on that. Also, it's important because, we have seen a few changes in the last few years. The way the analysis works hasn't changed since the pandemic, and that's this. When you have an artist who's coming to the US to do something that's related to their profession, it's safest to start from the assumption that they need to have an employment-based visa, unless you can find an exception to that rule. Here we go. Unless you can find an exception to that rule. And there's a handful of exceptions that relate to artists coming to the US to do things that are work-related, but as far as the US government is concerned, not work visas. The one that causes probably the most trouble is what is referred to as the showcase exception. And this is it's not really, there is no law that says there is a showcase exception, but it is something that has come into practice and is generally accepted by US Homeland Security and the State Department and Customs and Border Protection. So many of you are probably familiar with this. Basically, the idea is, if an artist is coming to perform at an event, which is a bona fide industry showcase event, meaning that the reason the audience is in attendance is not because they're there to be entertained, they're not there to have fun, they're there because they're considering hiring the artist at a future date. That's more or less the definition of an industry showcase. If an artist is coming to perform at something like that, then chances are good that they'll be allowed to enter the US on ESTA, if they're allowed to travel on ESTA, or on a visitor B1 or B2 visa. Now, what has changed in regards to showcasing is this. Historically, we have taken the position, and because we have taken this position, so have many of the showcasing events around the country, that while ESTA is fine for traveling to the US to do a showcasing event, it's unwise, because what you're doing is you're assuming that the officer at the airport is going to understand and believe what it is that you're doing. So imagine you're rolling up into JFK with 3 guitars and a bunch of other equipment, and the officer says, "What are you doing?" And you say to them, "I'm going to play a showcase. It's okay, I don't have a visa." You're assuming they're going to believe you and that they're going to understand how the showcase exception works, and risking that if they don't believe you, or if they don't understand how it works, you might get put on a plane and sent home. So historically, we've taken the position that instead of leaving that question to the officer at the airport, you're better off going to a US embassy in advance of your travels and getting a B1, B2 visa, actually a B1 visa, ideally, which is a little bit of a hassle, and it has to be done some weeks before you travel. But while it's legally unnecessary, it is kind of an insurance. Yeah. All right. I thought I heard somebody say something. I'm good. Okay. It's kind of an insurance policy against an officer deciding that you're not eligible for traveling to the US on a showcase. That's what we used to say, and most of the major showcasing events in the US followed that policy. Since the pandemic, US consulates around the world have been such a mess, and the delays for processing B1 visitor visas have been so extreme, and we've seen so many problems with the processing of visa applications, that we've kind of weighed the relative risks of well, what's the risk of an officer not believing that you're showcasing and thinking that you're coming to tour versus what's the risk of having some sort of delay in trying to get a B1 visa at your local embassy, or them losing their passport, or there being some kind of administrative screw up. And we've come to the determination that, at least for the moment, if you're eligible for ESTA, you're probably better off traveling on ESTA, as long as you've got a good invitation letter from the showcasing event. So that's one thing that we've seen that's changed.
And Matthew, if I may just jump in,
jump on in there.
The reason that, when Matthew says the consulates are a mess, I mean, it's crazy that we're this far along in the pandemic and this is still the case, but they remain short-staffed. And the main problem is that there's just an enormous backlog of visa applications, and most of the consulates have deprioritized B1, B2 visitor visas. They're prioritizing things like student visas, work visas, and so the B1, B2 visa sort of has gone to the bottom. Those applications have gone to the bottom of the pile, and it's hard to get a timely appointment.
Yeah, so part of the problem is staffing, but also, especially for the European US embassies and consulates, the ones in Europe, they are still reeling from the sort of double punch of the refugee crisis coming out of Afghanistan, and then the refugee crisis coming out of the Ukraine. And in both of those situations, not surprisingly, the interests of showcasing artists sort of take a backseat. So that's one significant thing we've seen. As always, we really recommend that if an artist is coming to showcase, that it's always, if there's any question about it, they should feel free to reach out to Tamizdat. Again, where we provide pro bono legal assistance to this kind of question. So if you're saying like, hey, I got invited to this showcase event, they say it's fine to come without a visa. I don't really know if they know what they're talking about. Can you talk to me about it? Can you look into it? We do this all the time. So always feel free to reach out to us. We don't decide what's a showcase event and what's not. What we decide is, what we help you understand is, what are the relative risks of assuming you're going to be allowed in or not. It's also important to point out that just because you don't get paid doesn't mean that it's a showcase. It's also important to understand that there's a difference between a promotional show and a showcase. Not getting paid doesn't obviate the requirement for an employment-based visa, which actually makes sense if you think about the fact that these visa laws are there to protect the interests of US labor and US musicians. So if you're not getting paid to do a show, it's actually in a way worse than getting paid, because not only are you taking a job away from a US musician or performing artist, but you're also devaluing their labor abroad generally. At least that's the way they see it. So that's always been that way, but it's sort of, but it's, the enforcement is always something that we're monitoring. As far as the other reasons for coming to the US to perform without an employment-based visa, those are kind of unchanged at this point. There's an exception that allows artists to come and perform at events that are 100% sponsored by their home country government, and the audience is non-pay. That's rock solid. We haven't seen problems with that. There are certain situations when an artist coming to perform as part of an academic program at a university or college. That's also, we haven't seen problems with those. We have seen a somewhat of an uptick in issues that managers are having when they're trying to come into the US because of the ambiguity between whether you're a manager or a road manager. Road managers need to have employment-based visas to go on the road with their artists, whereas managers don't. And we have seen issues in the last couple of years with with basically Customs and Border Protection deciding that an individual is actually a road manager when they think they're a manager, and denying that person entry to the US, which obviously is challenging if you've got artists who are coming over about to go on a tour and suddenly their road manager is denied entry.
I think some of the uptick in that problem too, Matthew, relates to the fact that with remote work becoming such a norm, people are coming for longer stretches of time, and if they're doing their day job from here, whereas before the pandemic, it was more, oh, my artist, I've got these 7 meetings and then I'm going back home. I think people are coming more often and for longer stretches.
Right. And the longer somebody is planning to enter the US for, the more likely Homeland Security is going to give it more scrutiny. If you come in saying, hey, I've got 3 meetings in New York over the next week and I'm going home, they're probably going to wave you through. Whereas if you say, I'm going to be here for 8 weeks and I'm going to be mostly in Venice Beach and I've got some meetings in LA, they might look at that. They might look a little bit more closely at what you're planning to do. So these are the updates we're seeing when it comes to traveling to the US on ESTA or on a B1 to do employment-related activities. So going back to the original analysis, if you look at, we start from the position that you need an employment-based visa to do anything professional as an artist in the US, unless there's an exception. These are 3 of the primary exceptions that relate to why you would not need that employment-based visa. But if you find yourself in a situation where it's like, yeah, none of those exceptions really apply, I guess I probably better get a performance-based visa or an employment-based visa. Hang on, if I can figure out how to advance. Oh yeah, this is a page we put in here just because people can't believe this is true often. The question is, wait, I've been coming to the US for years on ESTA and I've never had a problem with it. Isn't that fine? And of course, the answer we have to give to that every time is no, it's not. Even if it works, it doesn't mean it's legal. And it's also important to recognize that, and this is this is my finger wagging moment for the presentation. If you're an artist and you decide to come in under the radar and you're taking that risk on yourself, that's up to you. If there is a risk that an officer might decide that you're not coming in, that they're going to send you home, that you may have problems getting visas in the future. But if you're making that decision yourself, that's fine. That's up to you. That's a risk you can take. But I want to be really clear that if you're a manager or an agent or a presenter who's working with an artist to bring an artist to the US, don't tell an artist that it's fine to come in under the radar, because it's not your neck that's at risk, it's theirs. And the number of times that we see artists who say, oh, my manager told me it'd be fine, now I can't come to the US for the next 4 years, it's heartbreaking. So I think as someone who represents artists and guides them, it's important to recognize the worst case scenarios and realize that you shouldn't be giving advice that's going to lead them astray. And this is something that the prevalence of artists getting turned around is all in sent home because the officer has figured out what's going on. That's always getting worse. It's always slowly getting worse, and the scrutiny is getting higher. And certainly as expenses go up, more artists are always trying to figure out how to circumvent the cost of getting employment-based visas. So the officers are looking for people who fit the profile of, like, are you an artist on tour? Do you have the proper visa? If not, the chances of having a problem are certainly higher than they used to be.
Matthew, what about this question from the perspective of a presenter? Mark in the chat asked a really good question. That's sort of the flip side of this is, well, does the presenter have any potential liability when an artist comes in and say they successfully get in and then, they're performing without the proper work authorization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the interesting thing about that is the answer's sort of obvious, even though you wouldn't think it was. The answer to that is it's hiring an artist who is unauthorized to work in the US is no different than hiring a bartender who's unauthorized to work in the US. If you've got a bartender who you can't do a I-9, is that the form? I think so.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a bartender you can't do an I-9 for, that opens up your organization to certain risks, certain audits and liabilities. And it's the same thing with a performing artist. Now, because they come and go, it's less likely that it would be noticed, except the thing is the tax office is, again, always getting a little bit more savvy and a little bit more draconian in how they are trying to track down who is doing withholding. That's not strictly an immigration topic. That's really a tax withholding topic. But, we are always hearing horror stories from venues who are getting contacted by the IRS saying, hey, it looks to us like you had these artists. We haven't seen these foreign artists performing. We haven't seen the withholding from those performances. What's going on? Again, that's the frequency with which that happens is always just sort of slightly increasing over time. Aside from that, there's no, ICE doesn't routinely bust, concert venues to try and track down artists who are performing illegally. So there, you're not really on the kind of risk that, if you were like, say a meat processing factory or something like that, where you would more likely be a target. That doesn't really happen. And so the liabilities related to having an international artist who's not legal are limited in that way. But there is a degree of risk. Mark, was that a useful answer? Okay.
Yeah, the second part of the question was, should presenters be verifying artists that they have the proper visa before they come into the venue to perform and be paid? And how should they verify that?
I'll tell you this, the larger, more professional venues do that. Television networks definitely do that. They'll have to see, they want to see a scan of the visa or before they let somebody go on stage. So if that constitutes best practices, then yes, you should. And all you really need to do is if you get a scan of the visa, keep that on file. If there's ever a question about it, you can say like, no, I've got a scan of the visa. It looks to me like this person was authorized. So in that sense, that would be the verification process you would go through.
The late night shows go even one step further and ask. I mean, we get
Hi. I'll be right back.
From the late night shows asking for the actual I-129 form that was submitted on behalf of the artist to show that they're authorized to do specifically this type of work, performing work in this case. I think they're on the extreme end, but that is something that is possible.
Yeah. Moving on. So the second question is, okay, so you've determined that you do in fact need a work visa, or the artist needs an employment-based visa. What kind of visa do you get? This hasn't really changed in 20 years, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's basically the same as it's always been. O visas for individuals and there's crew, P visas for ensemble, P1 visas for ensembles, P2 is for Canadians, Canadian musicians and some British actors and actresses. P3 for culturally unique groups. We're not seeing great changes with that. The one thing I would say we've been seeing is we've seen Homeland Security really doubling down on the O2 visas for, is it just O2, Will, or is it O2s and P1Ss? It's both, right?
Say that again, Matthew. I'm sorry. I was responding to a question in the chat.
Okay, we've been seeing problems, a kind of an uptick in USCIS hassling petitions for crew, for performing artists, really wanting to see that crew members have a substantial historical relationship with the artist. And that's both O2s and P1Ss, isn't it?
Yeah, and P3Ss too.
Okay.
The support classifications, there's an uptick in the scrutiny. It's a small uptick, but it's somewhat significant.
So what that means is if you're bringing over an O1 artist or a P1 artist or a P3 artist and they're bringing a crew with them, you should be braced for either a conversation with whoever's preparing the petition that's saying like, I really need to see more evidence that this crew, these crew members have a real relationship with the artist that goes back, that we can demonstrate, or also possibly leaving enough time so that If there is a request for evidence from USCIS, you've got time to process that. Because again, assuming the crew is in fact essential and that you can't do the show without the crew. It's I mean, I hate to say this, but the reason they make it difficult is because they really want international artists to hire US crews. That's again, it's a labor priority. And they make it expensive and difficult enough that if it's feasible to hire a US crew, then it's almost always worth considering if there's a way to do it. Obviously, it's not always a way to do it, but if there is, that's probably worth considering. How do you get the visa? This process really hasn't changed very much in a very long time. It's always getting slightly worse and slightly stupider, but it isn't really substantially changing. This is the process is what it is, which is a U.S. entity files a petition on behalf of the artist. That petition has to establish that the artist reaches their career reaches the specific standard of whatever visa it is. So if it's an O1, you can show that they have extraordinary ability. If it's a P1, you can show that the ensemble has sustained international renown. If it's a P3, you were able to show that whoever is getting the visa is coming to do a culturally unique performance. So you have to show that they reach that standard, meets those magic words, and you have to show that they have bona fide employment scheduled in the US. Will, do you have any comments that you want to add about what we're seeing in terms of the process, this part of the process, the petition part? Is there anything that's sort of remarkable in the last year or two that you're seeing?
No, in fact, it's pretty normal. I mean, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in requests for evidence. You sort of alluded to that in the previous slide. There's certain things that they're scrutinizing a bit more, but it's remained pretty consistent, and timing of this step of the process remains, it fluctuates. It's constantly, anywhere from 3 weeks to 12 weeks. And right now we're sort of in the middle of that, unless you pay the immigration services expediting fee, which has actually gone up significantly in the last couple of years. But yeah, no, in terms of adjudications and timing, it remains pretty much the same. There's been a lot of talk about the proposed fee increase, which is that fee affects this part of the process. That's the USCIS filing fee, which there's a proposal to raise it from $460 to, I forget the exact number, but it's
around $2,500.
Yeah.
No,
but
around 1,500. Sorry.
Yeah, it's increased like the proposal is to increase it about 250-260%. It remains to be seen whether or not that will actually take effect. There's a lot of advocacy work happening to prevent that from happening, but that's something that's potentially on the horizon.
Right. We had when those fee increases were proposed, we had a flood of clients coming to us saying, hey, I want to get my petition filed before the visa fees go up. And I mean, we have no idea if that will happen or when it will happen, if it does. There's a lot of strong arguments against it that I think USCIS is going to have to pay attention to. There's also, I'm pretty confident that there's lawsuits being teed up to try to rein it in if they try to actually enforce it. So that's far from a done deal. But if it does come through, it will have a significant effect on the costs of the process. Not a massive effect in the sense that the fee increase is going to, it'll amount to somewhere in the realm of about $1,000 per act, an increase, which is no small amount of money, but it also, oftentimes the all-in cost of getting visas for an act are, $5,000 to $10,000. So an increase of $1,000 is significant, but not what I think a lot of people in the general public have understood this proposal to suggest. I bet there's comments. Are there any comments right now that we're missing?
I was just looking at those and responding to a couple.
Okay, great. So when the petition is filed in the U.S., it's filed with U.S. Homeland Security, with USCIS. They adjudicate it in, as Will was saying, somewhere between 3 weeks to 3 months right now. When that petition is approved, notification of the approval is sent to the U.S. Embassy or consulate in the wherever in the world the artist is residing, or wherever they happen to be, or actually it's really actually sent out to all the U.S. consulates and embassies around the world. And then the artist's job is to, I'm going to actually skip on to the next step 2 here. The artist's job is then to apply at a U.S. consulate or embassy for the visa to get it actually affixed into their passport. This is the part of the process which historically was really easy. It wasn't a problem at all. If you got your petition approved, which is effectively work authorization, getting the visa issued was kind of an afterthought. That is not at all how it is anymore, unfortunately. Right now, what used to be about 10% of our work in working with clients is probably, I don't know, Will, is easily 50% at this point, I imagine, is trying to figure out how to get people through the consular visa issuing process.
Yep.
So I'm going to sort of hand this over to you, Will, because I know you love talking about this. What do you see as being, can you just sort of go over the way how the process historically worked and where things are different now and where you see the biggest problems?
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is that this part of the process has always been fraught for individuals from certain parts of the world, the global South, countries that the US doesn't have good relations with. Those individuals, unfortunately, have always been subject to heightened scrutiny, and face more delays than, on average, than someone coming from Western Europe or other, richer countries or countries that the US has good relations with. So for everyone else, before the pandemic, this part of the process was usually really quick and easy and almost like a formality. So, you go through the first part of the process, which is the petition process. It's usually the longer, more complex, expensive part of the process. And then after your petition has been approved by US Immigration here in the US, for everyone who's not Canadian, everyone else in the world has to go through the second step, which is applying for a visa at your local US embassy or consulate, which involves completing an online application, which is a pain, but doable. And most, the individual applicant usually can handle that themselves. And then scheduling an in-person visa appointment, visa interview at the consulate. And forever, until March of 2020, for people from certain part of the world, this part of the process was really generally pretty fast and easy. You could get your petition approved 2 weeks before your tour, schedule an appointment the next week, and have your visa 3 days later. That has changed post-pandemic, and we talked about this earlier with sort of a confluence of factors, but there's staffing issues, there's backlogs, there's multiple crises throughout the world that the State Department is dealing with. And so now getting an appointment has become more difficult in many countries. And then processing after an in-person appointment has remained largely the same. It usually takes about a week after an in-person appointment. But something that complicates this a bit is the fact, and this sounds like a good thing, but the State Department recently expanded the eligibility criteria for individuals who can get a waiver of the in-person interview. And if you are granted a waiver of the in-person interview, then you can process by mail. Basically, you mail your passport and application materials in, and they process it and mail you back your visa and passport. That sounds like a good thing because, you know, for a lot of people, getting to the embassy or consulate is a pain. You know, getting up early and going and doing an interview can be annoying. But the problem is that processing after you mail in typically takes longer than after an in-person interview, and oftentimes there isn't time so it can take anywhere from like 2 weeks to 6 weeks or longer. So if you know, whereas before you could schedule an appointment, go in, get your visa back in 3 days. A lot of times, a lot of applicants are just sort of being routed to the mail-in process, to the interview waiver route, even if they would prefer to do an in-person interview because it's quicker, and it can be difficult to sort of get around that routing. And the primary difficulty, I think, at least for us in trying to advise people, is that the procedures and policies vary by post, and there's hundreds of consular posts throughout the world, and they're always changing. So for example, in London, which is actually the embassy in London is historically one of the better, more functional posts. It's huge and processes a bajillion applications a day. But so they up until like this week, there was a very clear process for requesting an in-person appointment in London if you were routed to the mail-in, but you didn't have time. And we've had dozens of artists that we've advised to say like, okay, you don't have time, your tour is in 3 weeks, you need to get an in-person appointment. You don't have time to mail in your passport and wait for it back. Or you have other obligations outside of the UK, other touring obligations, and you can't just leave your passport at the embassy for 4 weeks. Up until very recently, there was a pretty clear procedure for requesting an in-person appointment. As of like 2 days ago, it seems that has changed, and now we're hearing of applicants sort of getting contradictory advice from the embassy directly, and then from the third-party service that actually schedules the interviews and processes these things. So I use that example just to illustrate that what might have worked 3 weeks ago or 3 months ago might not work tomorrow. And what is possible in London may not be possible in Paris. Or the procedure for doing it in Melbourne is different than it is in Seoul. And so that's been the most difficult. And Matthew keeps joking about how I hate this, but it makes my job really difficult because there's no, it's always changing. The embassy and consulate websites are not updated properly. It's sort of just a mess. And can be really confusing. Does that sort of answer what you wanted me to talk about, Matthew?
It totally does. It also,
if I was rambling and ranting, it's because I've been in the trenches with this for months now, and it's just been very frustrating.
I think one of the frustrations for me on this topic, I'm going to be actually, you know what? I think I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. One of the frustrations for me on this topic is that part of the reason Tamizdat exists and was created was to help people avoid the legal industrial complex when they're trying to get artists into the US. And so with resources like Artists from Abroad or Tamizdat Avail helping that out, it has historically been possible for US presenters, festivals, organizations, agents, labels, whoever, if they're diligent and work hard and have a really tight budget, it's been possible for them to file petitions and get artists into the US without legal help. Certainly legal to do it, it's just hard. And I think I find this process with the consulates right now really difficult and hard to advise people on, because I want people to avoid the costs of hiring attorneys to do this work, because that's a huge line in any budget that seems ridiculous. The problem is that with the incredibly changing dynamic, in a negative way, situation at the US consulates, if you're not, like us lawyers, we're on listservs where we can go on and talk to every other immigration lawyer in the US and say, what do you know about what we're seeing in Seoul this week? What do you know about, the processing time? What do you know about them losing passports through the mail insert? Like, we have access to this incredible wealth of information, which normally is sort of like, it's helpful, but right now it's kind of essential to figuring out what's going on out there. And that's not something that's available to people in the field, to the layperson. And so to me, this is a really frustrating time, because it's hard to advise people to do this on their own, when doing it on your own means not necessarily having access to really critical information that, in that last phase of the process, we're like, well, the petition's approved, we got a show in a week, what do we do? So the one thing I would say to this is, if you are doing petitions yourself, a lot of times people reach out to their congressional offices as a last ditch effort, just like when everything else has gone wrong, and you're hoping that your congressional office can do a Hail Mary for you. And I would say they have access to the same information that we in the legal profession have access to, probably more. And if you're handling your own petition and you feel like it's not going right, you're feeling like what you're hearing back from the artist on the ground in their home countries doesn't sound promising. Like, oh, I hear I tried to schedule an interview and it says there's nothing available till 2024. Contact your congressional office sooner than later, because you're probably going to need help to get through the consular process. And if you don't have counsel on your side, then you certainly are going to want to have some congressional support. Don't try and do it alone.
The other thing I would say is budget more time for the consular part of the process than you did before 2020. If you used to leave a couple weeks, leave, a couple months. Everything takes longer than it used to. At this stage of the process.
Yeah. One thing I would say also, and this is good news to a certain extent, this is, as far as I can tell, this really is an administrative problem. It's not a policy problem. It's a personnel issue. We are consistently finding with higher profile artists, no matter where they're from, that if we can get the ear of the consular staff, by contrast with the last administration, the State Department is responsive to the notion of cultural exchange and the importance of cultural diplomacy. And so if you can find a way to reach a real person, it's generally possible to get stuff done. The problem is there's just not enough real people at the embassies to handle the workload. It's very gratifying when you find someone, they say, oh my God, that sounds like a really impressive and important show. We're going to do everything we can to make sure these visas are issued in time, because we can't imagine, being part of this not happening for the cultural fabric of America. And hearing somebody from the State Department say that is really, it's very heartening to hear that, especially after what we've been through with the prior administration. But again, their hands are largely tied by just not having enough staff to process the number of petitions or the number of applications that they're receiving. We've just done 50 minutes. We could open up to questions at this point. I guess the only last thing I'd like to say is, you alluded to this, Will, a little bit in terms of the advocacy that's happening. Tamizdat, working with APAP, working with the League of American Orchestras and a ad hoc coalition of major arts organizations in the US, which goes under the name of the Performing Artists Visa Working Group, is engaged with an ongoing effort to address these issues, the issues of regarding inequity, regarding lack of transparency, like unaffordability, basically a laundry list of the issues with the artist visa process in the US. And like anything that has to do with advocacy, it's a slow, long game. But there is a lot of work being done toward trying to make this process better. We are receiving, again, positive feedback from the administration about these efforts. I am hopeful that we will be making some progress in the next year or two on this. I can't anticipate what that will be, but just, there's a recognition that this process is unnecessarily complex and expensive, and not doing a good job promoting culture and diversity in the arts in the US, and a willingness to at least have a conversation about how that could be improved. So that part's exciting. And there is work being done. It's just very slow. Changing anything related to immigration in the US right now is not an easy project. So do you want to open, Willie, is it okay if we open up to questions at this point?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely, please
Maybe
do.
we can start. Oh yeah, go ahead, Willie.
No, I was saying yes.
Okay, cool.
Should we? I just see there's an outstanding question in the chat from Barry that I don't, maybe if Barry's still on and wants to verbally ask the question, I don't think I quite understand what.
Sure. Hold on a second. Yeah, I was just curious just to make sure. So like for bringing a Canadian group into the country, I just wasn't sure, do they not need the consular process, or is that, so if I go ahead and do a P2 for them, and it's not AFM, so it's not like the super easy thing that gets done, but so I would do a P2, but then once they get that, what do they do, just so I'm telling them the right thing?
Sure. If they're Canadian citizens, they don't need to go through the consular process. Canadian citizens don't need visas, with several very narrow exceptions, but generally Canadian artists, Canadian citizen artists don't need visas in their passports, which means they don't have to go through that second step, the consular processing. So yeah, once you get the P2 petition approved, they take that approval notice. It's called I-797, and that's their entry document. It serves as their entry document and their work authorization.
Oh, great. So they could then they just take that like to the airport when they travel, and that's all they need?
Exactly.
Okay, great.
Just out of curiosity, if you're not going through AFM, what's the program?
I haven't finished this. I was going to have to go through AGMA, I thought, because they're a bunch of they are performing with an orchestra, but they're a bunch of puppeteers.
Okay.
So
I would, before you get too far with it, I would just make sure, I don't know that AGMA or AGVA have P2 programs. They might, but that's something worth looking at.
sorry, a P1. Sorry, I didn't mean P2. Sorry, a P1, not a P2.
Oh, I see.
Sorry,
okay.
P1. So sorry.
Got it. Okay. In that case,
Sorry.
then
P1 just for a group, it's 3 people, but 4 people now.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Then as long as they're Canadian citizens, if they're Canadian permanent residents, but citizens, not Canadian citizens, not traveling on a Canadian passport, then, any non-Canadian citizen members would need to go through the consular process.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you.
On the topic, Barry, of Canadians, though, it brings up a topic that we've seen a number of times in the last couple of months, and that's the topic of First Nation Canadians and whether or not they need visas to travel and tour and perform in the US. This is a difficult question, and it's a little bit hard to talk about, because there is a treaty from the 1800s which states that First Nation Canadians do not need a work visa or work authorization, or they don't need a visa, is what it says, to perform in the US. That is not clear law in the current in the current legal system, it does not clearly state that they don't need, that they are something that First Nation artists need that other Canadians don't need. So we historically took the position that, like, no, all that law is saying is that First Nation Canadians are not treated any worse than every other Canadian. The weird thing is that we've really determined that in application, U.S. Customs and Border Protection does seem to take the position that First Nation Canadians do not need a work authorization to enter the U.S. to perform. It makes me nervous every single time because I don't think there's clear law behind it, but it seems to work every time. So if you are bringing First Nation Canadians into the US, it's certainly worth reaching out to us to have a conversation about whether you need to go through the visa process or not. I'm seeing a couple other questions here. Michael just had the interview process in Norway. It took much longer. Okay, that's not a question, but thank you for the comment there. Corrine, I anticipate moments of pleasure applying for visas for Cuban dancers. Yeah, Cubans, always a challenge, always an adventure, always worth, part of the problem with Cubans is not so much getting them into the US, but getting them out of Cuba. That's always a challenge as well. But at any rate, yeah, Willie.
I believe Michael Graf-Storian has a question.
Okay, go for it, Michael.
Okay, I think I've got the sound on it. You can hear me? All right, great.
Yep.
So I'm in Michigan. I have a roster of artists entirely comprised of people from Europe and South America. And I do the petitions myself in order to make touring a little more feasible financially.
Sure.
I, as you probably know, am required, because of where I'm located, to send my petitions to the USCIS office in California. I filed an 01 on August 1st. What I'm leading to is like what's going on in California, if you guys know anything. I filed an 01 on August 1st for a musician for whom I had gotten 6 or 7 previous 01s for a tour. I finally got an RFE on December 20th. The nitpick on the RFE was that even though I had contracts with all the presenters with me, even though I had the explicit form letter from the artist saying that I was appointed to represent him for this purpose to the USCIS, the nitpick was that I didn't have a similar letter from each of the presenters. So then the tour was beginning mid-February, and I wound up shelling out $5,000 for $2,500 for the 01, $2,500 for the 02. When I filed in early August, the processing time published was 6.5 months, or it wasn't, maybe it wasn't that bad at first, but then it quickly became 6.5 months. Mid-August, I filed another petition, another 01 for a guy from Brazil who had a previous 01. That petition got shuffled from California to Vermont in January and was finally approved without me having to do premium processing. So I've got more things coming. And I'm wondering what is going on with USCIS. I understand everything you've said about the consulates, and I've had my bit of trouble with that as well. But it seems like there's something going on with that California office. You look at the processing times, California versus Vermont, it doesn't make sense. I don't know if it's the agricultural industry that's running through California or the tech industry or what it is, but it's making me think I should open an office in somebody's apartment in New York and file with Vermont all the time, which, I've really seriously considered that, and I've been advised that that's maybe not a good idea. But I'm kind of, after what I went through and not seeing much in the way of improvement or having any basis for it, I'm scratching my head and thinking, what should I be thinking?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and something I sort of glossed over when I was talking about USCIS adjudications earlier, mainly because, with Tamizdat acts as petitioner for most of Covey laws for our firm's clients. And so most of what we're dealing with is Vermont, which historically has always been more predictable than California, but it's gotten exponentially, California's gotten exponentially worse. I actually don't know how long this slowdown has been going on, but it's significant. I don't know why California is so slow right now. I don't know if Matthew, if you've heard anything, but they have started, like you said, Michael, that they are moving some petitions from California to Vermont, which is obviously an acknowledgement that things are very slow in California. I don't have any great advice other than, we always encourage, if there's an entity on the East Coast that can file a petition, if there's a record label or, I might have missed, you're a booking agent? Yeah, if there's a record label or any entity that could file in Vermont, I would recommend it because, even with the moving of some cases from California to Vermont, California is showing no signs of speeding up as far as I know. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't know if you have anything to add, Matthew.
Not really. I guess nothing beyond what you were suggesting, that just, if there is probably, if you're an agent and there's a way that you can work through one of the venues to act as the petitioner, that might be one way to approach it.
Yeah.
Got an East Coast venue. Not a very helpful answer, though, I'll acknowledge that.
No.
Bernard has a question about Russian artists. Aside from the problem with consulates being available to them to get visas and the lack of functioning consulates in Russia, there isn't a problem per se. It's not like the Russian artists are being discriminated against in the consular or in the petition part of the process. I think the issue you might see, whatever embassy or consulate you take them to get their visas issued, there might be a concern, a heightened concern that they would be that a Russian artist might be looking for a way to emigrate to the U.S. Use an artist, performing artist visa to get into the U.S. and then remain. So there may be potential visa denials or delays while State Department and the consulate is struggling with, do you actually have ties to your home country, which sadly they may not. A lot of, so many Russian artists are trying to figure out how to get out of Russia right now. That might work against an artist in that visa process.
Yeah, and also, so that's definitely an issue. And if they're not, legally, if they don't have like permanent residence in France, that would be a significant concern. Also, many of the consulates, including Paris, are giving priority to citizens of the country where the consulate is located. So they're deprioritizing third country nationals, people who are applying outside of their country of citizenship or permanent residence. So at least that was the case in Paris a couple months ago, where it was really difficult as a non-French resident or citizen to get an appointment in Paris. So, September 2023, if that's what that's a little bit of a concerning time frame, I would say. I don't know. My analysis would change if they are lawful residents of France, in which case it would be a bit easier.
Mark's question, can a country's U.S. consul be a petitioner for an artist coming from their home country to the U.S.? Does that happen?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like an idiot, but I'm curious.
The consul, like the consulate.
Yeah, they're technically not U.S. They're technically not a U.S. entity, right? Because they're in the United States as representatives of their country. Are they,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so like, can the
Dutch consulate do a petition to bring in a Dutch artist to the United States?
most if it's a US, if they have a US entity, then yes. And I think a lot of those organizations have a close affiliation to, Friends of the Netherlands in the US, like, which would be a nonprofit, which is typically when we're working on a project with, say, the Dutch consulate, the cultural attaché at the Dutch consulate or the Dutch embassy, usually if they want to be filing a petition on behalf of a Dutch artist, they're going to work it through a US NGO that they're affiliated with. That's typically the way it works.
Got it. Thank you.
Other questions? Stacy, I see your hand.
Hey, yeah, thank you. We work with a company from Northern Ireland that is going to be working with a choreographer from India. And the wait times we're about to file for their petition, and the shows are in New York in October. They are going to have their Indian choreographer in Ireland for the rehearsals. And I'm wondering if it's safe to plan for him to interview there, because the wait times in India are incredibly long. And I've read that it's recommended to interview in your home country. So I don't know, if this would be a safe bet.
That's a good question. The wait times in India have been bad. They're getting better. And we have had artists get expedited appointments. So even if you're looking at the calendar and it says the next appointment isn't until 2024, it's possible to request an expedited appointment. And for performing artists, those requests are getting granted pretty frequently. That being said, India is one of the posts in India are really difficult right now, more so than most. The worry for someone who doesn't live in Northern Ireland to interview in Belfast is what I believe Matthew was talking about earlier. It's not as heightened of a concern as it would be for a Russian citizen right now, but generally speaking, and this has always been the case, the consulates scrutinize applications from third country nationals much more closely than they do for if you're interviewing in your home country. So that's the risk, and that can be overcome. So there's a legal presumption that anyone applying for a temporary US visa has an intent to immigrate to the US, and you have to overcome that presumption. And that presumption is harder to overcome if you are applying in a country where you have you're not living there and you're not a citizen. So that person would just want to be, I wouldn't say don't do it, but you might want to try India first. And if it doesn't work out, have that be plan B. And if you do plan B, I would make sure that that person is very well prepared to demonstrate their ties to India. So they have a family, they've got a home, they have ongoing professional obligations there, that sort of thing.
Which part of that would be if they're planning to travel to Northern Ireland substantially before coming to the US, make sure you have this conversation with them before they leave India, so as to make sure that if there's documentation that they want to bring with them, that they bring it with them, and don't realize, 2 days before they go to the interview that, oh, it'd be really great if I had, evidence of my mortgage or whatever it might be, and now I can't get it, or I have to FedEx it for hundreds of dollars from India. So that's something to think about with that. The other thing that's important to keep in mind in that situation is that while there's the presumption that anybody applying for a visa is going to emigrate, and you've got to overcome that presumption, and the way they articulate it is, we don't know that you're going to return to your home country. In practice, you don't actually have to show that they're going to return to their home country. You just have to show that they're going to leave. So if you've got a dance group that is based in Belfast, they're coming over to do some performances, and you've got contracts for those performances in the US, but then you've got performance contracts for them in London and in Brussels and in Paris following the US performances. Those are also material to that analysis, because if you can show documentation of those future engagements to the consulate when they're interviewing, they may well make the decision. I don't know that you're going back to India, but I know you're leaving the US, and that's good enough for me.
Okay, awesome. And if he were to get denied in Ireland, and then would that hurt him if he tried again in India?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
It'll be on, on his record, and he'll have to disclose it and might get asked about it. But yeah, that wouldn't be unovercomable, if that's a word.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions? Right down toward the end here. All right. Excellent. Willie, Krista?
Any more questions? Are we good? Like, we even gave you back 4 minutes. Oh, Bernard, I see your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, okay. My name is Bernard, and I represent a dance company based in France that employs mostly dancers from North Africa, Algeria, and Morocco. They have toured 16 times in the US and lived in Canada since September 2015. And they're coming back in January, early February for 4 weeks, and in May 2024 for a week and a half to the US and a bit to Canada. The question is, the company will present 2 different works. Work A is with his former, previous 13, 14 dancers, and work B is with 17 completely different dancers. And during 1 week of the January-February tour, the company is performing in 2 different cities, New York City and Dallas. One city with previous programs, and one city, New York, with the new program. Could it be a petition, 2 petitions for dancers and the company staff, combining all the dancers with 2 works, even though when we list the performance or the dates of the cities where the company will perform, if the company will, we will overlap 2 different programs in one city, in 1 week. You know what I mean? Is that clear?
Yeah. Bernard, here's what I'm going to recommend with that. Just because this is really detail specific and we're going to have some questions about it. Are you filing the petition yourself?
I hope not. And I did it a long time ago and I want to do it. And I mean, you guys.
What I would recommend, I'm going to put my email in here at Tamizdat. What I'd say is just reach out to me, because I'm going to want to have a conversation about the details of that, because there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I want to make sure we're giving you the best advice. So there's nope, that's not it. Here, to everyone. That's my email address. Just drop me a note, Bernard. And we can just have it out as to what the best way to be.
Okay, we'll do.
All right.
That's a fun question.
It sounds like a law school exam question, doesn't it?
I feel like we've dealt with this before, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's DJ duos who want to like maximize they wear masks and they want to DJ in Miami and LA on the same night and both be billed as the same artist. Anyway, that's a fun one.
Have fun with that. That'll be awesome. Thank you, Bernard, for that. Thank you all for coming today. We've put a link in the chat, which is a quick survey just to give us your feedback on today and to share any feedback for the next session or anything you'd like to see us do differently, or since this is the first in the series. So really appreciate your feedback and help us help you as we refine what we're offering to our members as part of our year-round programming and make sure it's as responsive and on point as you need it to be. And I just want to thank Matthew and Will and Boo and Willie for all that you did today to make this such a successful event and sharing your deep expertise with the members. Really appreciate you. You're treasures, and just know that the presenting, booking, and touring field really honors your work and is thankful for all that you do for us and on behalf of us and our artists. And so with that, everyone, I hope you have a great rest of the day. We're leaving right on time, and we'll see you the next time.